That's kind of the thing I observe when you leave the West. It's like being in a house. If you're in a house, you're not necessarily self-aware you're in a house until you leave and you turn around and you see the house. You're like, aha, yes, I see the house now. I understand the house. And I think if you want to understand Western culture more, I would say just leave the West for a long time and go to a place which is different. Because then you can like kind of sort of speak, turn around and you can see the West and you're like, oh, now I get it. Oh, I understand this.
I will run, I will rise, I will grow like the world's never known.
Alright, welcome to another evolution of one. Been interesting to see how people respond to some of this, so thanks for listening to my conversations that I have with some of my friends. Today we're talking with Jordan, who I used to work with, and he's one of the most interesting people that I've met. I really love his kind of mindset. I think we have a really good discussion. We talk about kind of what he's been up to, living abroad, and I found it fascinating to kind of talk to him about switching up the mindset of, instead of having a home base, being able to live a more nomadic life and still have a career and job and not be tied to a physical location, which is really interesting. So let's just jump into it. Here's my conversation with Jordan. There we go. I think we're recording now.
Hello, world.
Yes, hello world. So you're coming in from Tokyo. What's going on with this? I thought you were in San Francisco.
Well, I was. I lived in San Francisco for like 4 or 5 years after I moved out of Texas. And so it's a funny story, actually. So I was in San Francisco, and like around like the last 6 months I was living there, my life was really comfortable. It was really cushy. It's like that feeling you get up when you wake up in the morning and you're in your bed and it's nice and warm, and you're like, oh, and you just don't want to leave the bed, and you're like, oh, this is so good. And you're like, if I could be in this bed for 20 years, I would totally do this. And that's kind of how I kind of felt in San Francisco. It was kind of this sort of comfortably numb sort of feeling. Like I had a pretty good job. I mean, I was self-employed, so that's pretty nice. I had a pretty nice group of friends. I lived in like, I mean, I couldn't see the Golden Gate Bridge from my apartment itself, but if I climbed on the roof of my building, I could. So I was in the northern part of town, so I was right next to the bridge and the bay, and the view was beautiful. But there was this feeling of like, oh, this comfort, like, oh, I could keep doing this for 20 years, is at the same time, like, I could totally see myself living here for 20 years. It has this sense of like comfort and familiarity, and there's also this like sense of fear. You're like, I could actually be here for 20 years. Like I could be 40 years old and be doing the exact same thing. That kind of like scared me a little bit, right? Like, so comfort isn't all good. That's this idea of we should place comfort at the highest moral, as like a moral virtue above the rest, I think is a terrible idea. So I decided, well, I can do my job remotely, right? Because I use a computer, and I always like traveling, so why don't I just go on like a big world trip? Like I'll just travel the world and work remotely for like a year or 5 years or 10 years, I don't know, and just don't really have like a path. Just go to one country and stay for a bit, and then go to another country, and just kind of keep like doing that, and like, you know, why not see the world? And so I did that. So I was going to start in the East. So I was going to start in East Asia and then kind of make my way westwards through Eastern Europe and the Middle East and probably like North Africa, and then probably like South America, and then maybe back in the United States. Like I didn't know if I was going to move back to the United States necessarily at the end. That was kind of like the direction of travel, and then I kind of plan was to kind of make it up along the way. And then Corona attacked and everything changed. So travel is not why. So it's kind of like a mixed bag. On one time, it's like the worst time to pick to have a world trip. At the same time, I'm super happy I'm not in the United States right now, because you guys have like the most. I mean, China's got the most amount of cases in the world. Clearly, they're lying. It's pure. Can I curse? But
Absolutely.
oh, it's bullshit. Like they say they've got like 5,000 deaths. This is a complete lie. And anyone who agrees with this and thinks that America's got the worst amount of cases is literally a communist shill. Okay, they're literally supporting communist ideology, and they're an enemy of the people, and you know they better watch out. But China's like the worst, but America's doing not too great. So America's that, and you got like the race war going on in the streets and shit. So being stuck in Japan, and the Japanese are very, very clean. They're I don't know if a people I don't know if a nation can be autistic. Like, I don't know if that's actually possible, like biologically, but they totally are. Like, there's no other way of explaining it. And I don't mean that like in an insulting way. I mean like matter of factly. They're like cats that clean themselves all day. They're super clean. It makes you realize how dirty Westerners are. And so a country with like an OCD obsession with cleanliness and order is probably the best place to be during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And also it's a pretty interesting country. So I don't mind having been stuck here for I think about 5 months. I've been in Tokyo. I did a couple of countries first when I started my trip. I started like at the end of last year, so December 2019 is when I started kind of traveling. I went to a couple of countries and I landed in Japan. Plan was to stay for about 2 months, and now travel isn't exactly a thing. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I've just been in Tokyo, but I don't mind. I've learned a lot. It's a very, very peculiar society, the Japanese.
So you stay working remote. You're still taking clients and doing stuff, just not from San Francisco.
Kinda. So after I left Texas, I worked for a startup, like a 10-man dingy startup in downtown San Francisco. So if you've ever seen the show Silicon Valley, that's pretty accurate. Like Mike
Mhm.
Judge's stuff, he did like Office Space, he also did like Silicon Valley. His stuff is actually pretty accurate. The only critique of the show Silicon Valley that I can say is that the pace of the show is much faster than what actually happens in the real world. But it's a TV
Mm.
show, right? So it's gotta have a beat. So I don't flaunt him for that. But otherwise, like the over the top egos, the ridiculous personas, the obsession with your work, that's entirely accurate. Um, the San Francisco tech industry, it feels like a parody of itself sometimes. And so I did that for about a year, and then I was like, why don't I try my own thing? So I decided to try and become like a consultant, like a freelance software engineer. Um, and so I did that for a while. Went pretty well. I had like some bigger projects. I had one project I had to hire like 3 other engineers. It lasted about a year. I had to hire like 3 other engineers to work with me, and we were building like not just one thing, but a suite of different software tools for this startup. And then, well, my goal has always kind of been to build my own product, right? Like learn how to build products, learn how this works, like learn the technique, so to speak, and then kind of try my hat at my own thing. And if it fails, then okay, either I go back to having clients, or maybe I get like a corporate job again, or something like that. But the lockdown is actually kind of a blessing in many ways because there's nothing to do. Like the first month or two in Tokyo, everything was locked down completely. Like now it's a lot better, but there was nothing to do, so I just coded all day. And so yeah, I've been working
Mm.
on my own like not personal, it's a commercial product. Right? I've been working on my own commercial product for the last couple of months, and it's pretty close to getting released soon. I hope. What's the joke is the last 5 or 10% always takes half the time, or something like
Yeah.
that. Um, Anyone who's ever built anything knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm in like the final stages of like testing and finalizing like the payment scheme and all that. But yeah, and hopefully that goes well, and hopefully that generates a bit of revenue, and then I'll never have to work for anyone else ever again.
And so the goal is to continue traveling, or do you plan on coming to the States or moving to
Well,
back to France, or what? Where do you end up going after you can start traveling again?
I don't know. My plan at first was to spend a lot of time in East Asia, just as a starting point, because East Asia is pretty close to California, right? I mean, relatively speaking. Um, but I think I might go down to like New Zealand or Australia, go back into like the Western world for a little bit, um, and then kind of like swoop up to Asia. But the one thing I've noticed since I've started my little like pretentious digital nomad journey, and it's very pretentious, I'm self-aware of this, is the way that you perceive the model of the world and how you travel in the world is different. So a lot of people, when they travel, how it works is they have a job, right? They work like 40, 50, whatever hours a week, and they get a couple weeks off a year. Some people get no weeks off a year, unfortunately, but you get a couple weeks
Hey,
off a year.
sorry.
Mhm.
Before you keep going, can you
Yeah.
can you move your camera so you're not just like a floating forehead? It's just like
Oh, okay. The tables are really low here in Japan. The ergonomics are terrible. Oh, one sec. I'm gonna get that I'm gonna get that chair. I think I can put my computer on the chair, and that'll give you a better altitude. Because otherwise, I'm gonna be looking down on you from the angle. Like their tables here are like a foot and a half off the ground. Because Japanese people used to sit on the floor back in the day. Okay. Is this better?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. No, sorry about that. Yeah, it's hard. Like ergonomics in this country is trash. But where was that? Yeah, so the model a lot of people have is they have like their home base, right? So if it's a Monopoly board or a Risk board or whatever, they have their home base and they have their piece, and they temporarily leave the home base and they go to another location. You go 2 weeks vacation in Mexico or something like that. You do that, and then you return back to home base. And then every once in a while, maybe you'll move home base somewhere else, right? Maybe you'll move to another city or state or country or whatever. And since I've started traveling, my mental model of that has shifted. So there's no real home base anymore. There's only me. And so it's essentially the world is like a giant board, and I can just move my piece from one place to another. So like, am I going to go back to France and the United States at some point eventually? Like, yeah, definitely. I mean, unless the plague lasts like 50 years or something. But I do plan. Am I going to necessarily stay for a long time and live in these countries? Like, maybe, maybe not. It's this sort of like detachment aspect you have once you start traveling more, although I haven't done that much, to be honest, because of the plague, where you don't necessarily have like a home base. You just kind of go wherever you want. So if you like a place, I'm like, okay, this place is particularly keen. I'm particularly keen on it. Maybe I'll live here for a couple of years, and then maybe I'll move on or not. So there's this sort of like detached property. Yeah, I don't know.
So
After all, I just get bored, and maybe I just want to like settle down somewhere. There's some stuff which you lose from traveling. Like I used to have like a really dope computer and like a really like nice like VR set, which I like to play around with, but I don't have that anymore. I just have like my MacBook and like a Kindle. That's basically it.
So one of the questions I have is how are you able to do that from like a visa? Like, how do you go to each place and be like, hey, I'm gonna, like, how are you declaring? I haven't really traveled, but that's been one of the things in my mind. Like, how are you determining how long you could be in a place?
That's a really good question. And in a sense, the government hasn't caught up to the idea of like modern nomadry. Although when has the government ever caught up to anything? So that's a larger problem. So it basically boils down to what passport or passports you have. So if you are like an Iraqi, for example, the Iraqi passport gives you very, very few travel options. Like in general, African and Central African and Middle Eastern passports are like not very good in terms of traveling. American passports are quite good. They're not ranked the highest in the world, but with an American passport, you can just show up to a lot of countries, essentially visa-free. They just put you a stamp on your passport, and you can stay between 1 to 3 months. So, for example, when I went to Thailand, which was the first place I went, I was thinking of going to Japan first, but it was kind of cold, so I decided to go to Thailand first. It's a lot warmer. And it's so hot, oh my God. And then you just can stay for a month. So you just go to Thailand, you have a stamp, you can stay a month, no paperwork or anything. When I go to Japan, they stamp is 3 months. But I keep getting extensions because of the Corona thing. So what you do once your time expires, you just go to another country. And so you go to another country. So say you're in Thailand and you go to another country for like another month or two. You can always go back to Thailand afterwards. Or you can do a trick, which countries don't necessarily like, where you leave the country for a little bit and you come back. So here's a good example of the privilege of the wealthy and the unfairness of society and how you can exploit it for your own personal gain. So I was in Thailand a couple months ago, and my passport, not my visa, 'cause it's technically not a visa, but my temporary visitor pass was almost expired. I only had a week left. And I'm like, okay, well, I want to stay in Thailand a bit longer. Like a month isn't a very long time. So I'm going to go to the immigration department and I'm going to ask for an extension. And most places let you do this, right? Unless if you're assuming you have no criminal record or anything like that, if you go and you ask for an extension, they'll often give you 1, maybe 2 extensions. So I go there. However, because this was when Corona was starting to ramp up in East Asia, it hadn't really hit the West yet, but it was starting to get bigger in East Asia. The Thailand or the Bangkok immigration department was filled with Chinese people who wanted to extend their visas because they didn't want to go back to China, obviously. And so the lines were enormous. Like I was there and I was like doing the math because like you show up, it's like the meat market. You get a number. There's a number on the board, and you see what speed the numbers increase on the board, and you look at your number, and you do a bit of math. And I'm like, I'm gonna be here for about 10 hours, give or take. Like I will legitimately be here for 10 hours at the rate that this is going. And you can tell that the Thai immigration authorities were just not used to this many people. Like it was just mess. Like there was like too much. And I was like, I can wait here for 10 hours, or I can just fly to another country, spend like a week there, and come back, and that'll reset my my visa clock essentially. So I just looked on my phone when I was there. I'm like, oh, it was a flight to Bali. I can go to Bali, Indonesia, for $150. So not that much money. I'll go there, spend a week there, and when I come back, my visa will be reset. So problem is solved. So I did. I spent like a little week in Bali. Bali is a horrible place, but some parts of it are nice. I spent a week in Bali just driving around the island like a little scooter. I went to all like the different parts of it. Yes, I just went to Bali for a week, and then that took care of the problem. So now the problem is if you're a really cheap, frugal traveler, $150 to just fly to another country, and then Bali's a pretty cheap island, but all the additional expenses with that isn't something you can necessarily do, and then you're forced to wait 10 hours in line and pay like the $10 or $20 or whatever for the visa extension. But if you got a little bit of capital, you can just throw money. Money is a weapon to make your problem go away, fundamentally, and you can just for like $150. Get a ticket, hang out in Bali for a week, come back, and the visa problem has taken care of itself.
So then, so that's what you did. Then you went back,
yeah.
And then at what point did you go to Tokyo then?
About 5 months ago.
So but how long did you stay back in Thailand for?
Total of 2 months. I was there for like a month. Yeah, so basically I was in San Francisco, right? So I got rid of my apartment. I sold all my stuff. I thought about keeping my stuff in storage or just keeping the apartment, but the rent in San Francisco is so cartoonishly high. If I did the math, it's cheaper if you just sell, or even better, get rid of all your stuff, leave, and if you ever come back, buy everything again. Like just buy it brand new, because the rent is so high and my stuff was relatively cheap, that you'll save money that way. So there's no point actually holding things, which I think is a weird thing, because you'd think that possessions would be more valuable than rent. In many places, that's not true. So you're actually better off getting rid of this stuff. So I left.
That's very interesting.
So, yeah, it's really strange. Like in late December, I spent some time in New York and New Jersey, which is where my family lives. And then I went to Thailand. I went down to Bali. Then I went back to Thailand. And then I spent, I've been in Tokyo for a while. I haven't actually left Tokyo yet. I probably will now once I finish my little project, because I'll have a bit more time. And everything's opened up again. But the first couple of months in Japan, I'm like, well, there's no point really traveling to see anything, because all the tourist stuff is locked down. But in general, Japan's much more open than the United States is now. There's much, the quarantine is much more controlled. Or at least it seems like it.
So how are you able to stay that long then, if you said you can only stay for 3 months, but you've been there for 5? Did you get a special extension because of quarantine or because of the COVID stuff?
Yeah, basically. If you can show the Japanese immigration. So the Japanese immigration, in general, Japanese administration, like Japanese bureaucrats are probably the worst in the world. Like they'll follow the rules. It's like a nation of robots. I'm not racist. They're literally a bunch of robots, and they'll just follow the rules. And one thing I realized, so the expression, the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, right? And we see those as two different things. I think that's a Western concept, right? I think the idea of the spirit of the law is a Western idea. Now, I want to be more precise. I'm not saying that Westerners believe that the spirit of the law is more important than the letter of the law necessarily. I'm saying we recognize that there is an idea of a spirit of the law, and there is an idea of a letter of the law. And it seems to me, granted I haven't spent that much time in Japan and I barely speak the language, that in Japanese culture, and I think this is true about other Oriental cultures, they don't really have this concept. It's just the rules. That's just how it is. So the idea of the rules having an exception is kind of alien. They don't get it. It's like, no, they're just the rules. This is just what you do. Like the government says wear a mask, you just wear a mask. Like that's just like, what are you doing, stupid? It's just how it is, right? While I find this idea of debating the specifics, it's very much like a Western Western thing, like a Western social democratic type of thing. Like you're trying to debate the specifics of the instance. And so the rules are that they'll give you an extension if you can demonstrate that you cannot go back to your host country, right? Like, and the main way of doing that is showing that there's no flights, right? So if you can show that there's no flights back to your country, then like, well, you cannot leave. Obviously, there's no flights. Ergo, will grant you an extension. However, what's happening now is we're in this weird position where this happened to a lot of people, including me. If you book a flight somewhere, it will often get canceled at the last minute. So you'll book a flight, and then like 2 or 3 days before your flight's supposed to go, you'll get a message saying, hey, flight's been canceled because of COVID. So you're in a situation where you can purchase flights, but there's almost no guarantee that the flight is going to go through. I don't know what percentage of flights get canceled, but it's non-trivial. And in general, you probably don't want to travel like with a global plague going on. Like being trapped in a metal box in the sky with a bunch of people for like 12 hours is not the wisest thing, I think. So you have to convince them that, oh, you see, I can buy a ticket, but the ticket is getting canceled. And they're like, no. You have to show it. You can't buy a ticket at all. I'm like, yeah, but if you buy a ticket and the ticket gets canceled at a high percentage, that makes it, impractical to fly. You have to convince them, and it's a similar thing. So there was that. I tried to also apply for the different visas to try and extend my stay. I tried to apply for like what's called a high wealth visa. Basically, if you have enough money, they'll give you a 6-month visa for free. Now, the thing is, the visa doesn't cost a lot of money. It's not like, hey, this is a $10,000 visa. The visa itself is free, but it's only available if you have a certain amount of wealth. but it's free, which means I'm like, it's free, but poor people can't afford it in a sense, which I find kind of funny. But they only count what is in your savings account. I'm like, well, I don't have a savings account. Savings accounts make you lose money because of inflation is larger than the amount you get on a savings account. And like, no, we only count savings account. I'm like, well, maybe in Japan everyone's got a savings account because people are like in 1980. But in America, a lot of people do not have savings account anymore. So people who don't have a lot of money don't have savings accounts. And then people who have a bit more money, like the professional class and above, often don't have savings accounts because they'll just take their surplus capital and invest it in like, stocks and bonds and options and stuff like that. Right. And I'm like, so what you need to do is actually calculate like net worth. That's what you're actually looking for as a metric. It's not literally how much is in a savings account, because that metric only works if you're looking at Japanese people. And they're like, no, the rules say savings accounts only. I'm like, yeah, but I know millionaires in America who don't have savings account. Like, a lot of people don't have savings account. It's pointless. You just lose money. And they're like I understand, in Nihonjin, the Japanese, you have savings account. You're a very traditional. You don't rock the boat. You're a very conservative people. You just go the way of the savings account. Fair enough. I'm not knocking it. I'm saying that foreign countries do things a slightly different way. And they're like, the rules say savings account. I'm like, oh my God. So eventually I got one. And at this stage, it took much haggling and pleading with Nihonjin. But eventually, being tall and white probably helps. I mean, I'm not tall. I'm 5'10", but by their standards, I'm pretty tall. And at this point, I have until December. My temporary visitor pass is till like December 5th. And hopefully, maybe by then, Corona will be gone. It's not going to. Spoiler alert. It's getting worse. No. Maybe I can travel, or maybe it'll be a lot more muted in East Asia, and I can maybe travel more. Like maybe New Zealand. Because New Zealand only has like 12 cases or something, right? So maybe they'll open up soon. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of other places where they're recovering. We have no hope of recovering anytime soon. So I imagine you're going to be away for a while at least.
That's very much like the slogan of 2020. We have no hope.
Yeah, it's funny because like here in San Antonio, after quarantine, like when it wasn't mandatory anymore, numbers just started going through the roof. And so what they did is they actually stopped showing the daily count. They started to show aggregate numbers so that you can't see that like, and one day we had 5,000 cases. And they're like, well, we don't want to show this in one day just in San Antonio. Yeah.
Oh my
God. Was like, and so like after quarantine, people are just like, I can't take this anymore. Nobody's wearing masks. And so everything's just like skyrocketing. And I'm like, it got worse after COVID, after the quarantine. Like it drove people so insane that they're like, I just have to go out and do everything. And I'm like,
Go out and lick
this,
all the door handles.
yeah.
No, it's crazy. Like,
What?
a friend. I'm sorry, what?
No, I was just gonna say, like, the two things, like, we talked about that, and it's the combination of like being trapped inside and then Black Lives Matter and having all these rallies. People are like, I have to do these.
We're hilarious. I'm like, now is not the time to have a huge rally. Like, let's have a huge rally. And I was arguing with a friend of mine. He's like, the sign of this rally is a sign of changing times and new values or something. I'm like, people are just bored and unemployed. That's why it's this big. Like, had the George Floyd thing happened without COVID, actually George Floyd had COVID, you know, which I think is unrelated, but it's interesting side note. The little footnote in history there. If there was no COVID, but it still happened, maybe you would have still had, you know, protests and rallies and all that in the streets, but it wouldn't have had nearly the number of people because society would still be mostly operating the same way. So it's mostly a function of everyone being out of work and bored, which is the most logical explanation for the large size of it. And he was like, no. Like this, the people are rising, and it's sort of like kind of diatribe. Yeah, but I was talking to a friend of mine a week ago who's a Japanese dude, and he's like, wow, Tokyo got 500 new cases today. That's insane. I'm like, Tokyo is the biggest metropolis in the world, and San Antonio is much, much smaller. And you get like 10 times the cases. But yeah, I tell like some Japanese, I'm like, you know, America's got like 30 or 100 times the cases of Japan, like per capita, right? Because it's 3 times as many Americans as Japanese, and their eyes are like, what? Like, like the Japanese in general don't really understand a lot about the rest of the world. They're kind of like the Americans in that sense, but the Japanese actually don't travel a lot, and the Western world is a foreign world to them, which makes sense. Like, you know, like I walk around in Japan, like, oh, look at all these foreigners. I'm like, look at all these aliens. I'm like, no, I'm the foreigner. I'm the alien. Everyone here is normal. But their cultural framework, like the historical and cultural framework, and like the metaphysical view they have in the world is very different from what we have in the West. So some stuff which in the West we assume everyone knows, they have no clue what it is. They have no reference point. And then first you're shocked, and then you realize, well, actually that makes sense. They're from halfway around the world, so it makes sense they don't really know what this is.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty good. The only people who do not wear masks, I find, are white people in Japan. Are the only. That's not true. Some Japanese don't wear masks, but for the most part, it's like 9 out of 10 wear masks. And everyone washes their hands with alcohol, you know, like little cats, all that. Very military.
I feel like they're the exact opposite when you talk about like following the rules. I feel like the minute that people are like, we need to wear masks, they're like, well, fuck that. Like, you can't tell me I have to wear a mask.
Yeah,
like,
dude.
there's this post that was showing the Spanish flu and 1918 or whatever, and they showed like people with picket signs being like the same thing, like you were supposed to wear masks, and it was people like boycotting mask wearing back then. It was like, you know, some things never change, and it's just this sign. It was like, you know, it's your right not to choose not to wear a mask. And I'm like, don't you realize that that's like making the economy worse? Like we can't, like, you're not helping anybody by doing that. But like, it's just the idea that like there's a rule there, and like, well, you can't tell me what to do. Like, it's my freedom of being me. And it's like at some point you're like, for the greater good, like we all need to, like, there are rules that we need to obey. Like, don't kill people and wear a mask so we don't have to keep doing this. Like, just like basic things, I think. But it's like opposite, where they're like, wait, break the rules. Like, what do you mean? We don't do that over here.
Yeah, they don't get it. I think it has to do with kind of like the metaphysics of like the West versus like the East, or more specifically Japan in this case, where white people love to bicker about bullshit, to be blunt. Like, I kind of am away from it because it's true. Like, I'm kind of away from it because I'm like in Japan, right? And so I talk to my friends, and talking to you right now, and so I've got like, I'll read like the internet every once in a while, so I get kind of like sort of like a feedback. And you look at a lot of the problems we have in the West. The West doesn't actually have any problems. The West is the most powerful, prosperous part of the world, with the exception of some places like Japan, which are about as prosperous, you know, give or take. And we don't have any real problems, so we just invent problems, right? Like the amount of like bickering and whining you see with like people in San Francisco, which is like one of the richest, most interesting cities, I think, in the West, if not the world, compared to like the down to earthness of like Africans I've met who live in like literal mud huts. Or no, they're a bit more high tech. They have steel huts now, like old corrugated metal. Like they are much more comfortable in their own skin. They're like, yeah, we're poor, but like whatever, that's cool. They're much more like they're not whiny. In fact, apparently, there is a term for this on the Chinese internet, which I think it's actually accurate to call the Chinese internet because it's kind of blocked off from the rest, right? But apparently, and I haven't verified this, but on the Chinese internet they have a term called I think it's Daozhou or something like that. I'm definitely pronouncing it wrong, so if anyone's Chinese, they can correct me. I think it's Daozhou or something, which means like white left or something like that, and it means just like the crying and the mewing that a lot of Westerners have over things like civil rights and the environment, and basically issues that only Westerners care about in the world, to put it bluntly, and kind of avoiding like larger real problems and like the actual state of the majority of the globe. So a lot of other cultures that aren't Western, but that still interface with the West, are kind of aware of this kind of like whininess in Western culture. A lot of Westerners aren't really self-aware of it, I find. That's kind of the thing I observe when you leave the West. It's like being in a house. If you're in a house, you're not necessarily self-aware you're in a house until you leave and you turn around and you see the house. You're like, aha, yes, I see the house now. I understand the house as a concept. And so I think if you want to understand Western culture more, I would say just leave the West for a long time and go to a place which is different, because then you can like kind of sort of speak, turn around, like figuratively anyway, and you can see the West and you're like, oh, now I get it. Oh, I understand this. And yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the things that I don't know if you follow Trevor Noah. I really like a lot of the stuff that he talks about. But one of his comedy routines, he talked about how travel is the best medicine for ignorance, and how it's like when you're stuck in that thing, it's easy to just like be ignorant and not learn. And it's by going out and experiencing new places that you're able, like exactly like you're saying, that you're able to see it from a different perspective, because you're literally removed from the situation. It's hard to do that when you stay seated in it. And I think that happens so much, especially with people in the States, is that they don't get to take a chance to see it from even just like another state. Like a lot of people still grow up and stay in the town they grew up in, and it's fine if that's what you want to do. I just think there is a I think there is a benefit to expanding your horizon from the sense of understanding. And this is one of the things that I saw when I went to France. I know like France and America, it's like it felt the same, right? There was so much that was like everyone had iPods and like it was a first world country, but there was cultural things, but at the same time it was like people are just people. And it was this opportunity to just break away from the American culture, understand this other culture that had its own rhythms and its own thing, but was very much first world. And so I didn't get to see like that much of a difference, but at the same time, that was enough to be able to remove myself from just growing up in this small town to be like, this world's like super huge. Two, I'm not right. I'm comfortable with the things that I know. And that doesn't mean I'm right. It just means it's what I know. And the minute that you step back and talk to other people that have had a different experience, you're like, oh, so they can both be true and be counter to each other. And I think that concept, it takes, conversation with diametrically opposed viewpoints to be able to see and recognize that there's not necessarily, I think we've talked about this before, the concept of like right and wrong is so ingrained, and I don't know that it's accurate. I don't, like, two things can be, like, depending on the viewpoint, can be seen as right or wrong, and it's a lot of times the way that we view it or the way that we talk about it or relate to it that give us the notion of its moral or inheritance of good or bad. But the concept itself is actually not. It's perspective what you're considering good or bad.
I have a few thoughts on that. I think So this idea of like the good versus the bad is kind of like a Western Christian metaphysic. And one thing I've noticed since I've kind of traveled around the world is that, and traveled to different parts of the world, and this might be a bit controversial, but I'm like, all Westerners are basically Christians, even if they don't actually believe in like the literal Christian God. They behave as if they do, right? Like the foundation of like Western civilization, for the most part, is inside a Christian metaphysic. Like, I'm not saying it's the only thing that contributes to it, and I'm not sure if it's like Western civilization influenced the evolution of Christianity in Europe, or if it's Christianity that influenced West European culture. Like, I'm not sure which one did which, but there's definitely like a correlation there. And so this idea of like good versus the bad is kind of like, in a sense, it's not, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's a Western perspective. And different parts of the world see things kind of like in a different way. So, for example, in the Japanese, there's more emphasis on just duty. Like, this is just what you do. This is your responsibility. And they seem to be a bit less concerned with matters of good versus bad. It's more about order and harmony, right? So I think Westerners' society places a large emphasis on justice, which is, you know, kind of like where you have derivatives like social justice and all that. And they place less of an emphasis on order. Of course, we still put emphasis on order in the West. It's just that it seems to me we put justice a little bit higher than order. Well, in the East, they're like, in the Oriental, like East Asia, I mean, they seem to put a larger emphasis on harmony. They're like, no, harmony is important. Like, harmony is necessarily more important than like individual justice. Now, you can make an argument, no, individual justice is more important than harmony, and I would agree for the most part. But to think that harmony has no value whatsoever is kind of short-sighted, right? Like, there's virtue in having a society where you're not tearing each other at the neck, you know, trying to tear each other's faces off all the time. There's a value in that. Another thing I've concluded is the idea that different systems work for different people. So let's imagine a world, and also we try and abstract ideology from the people that inhabit it, and I think that's difficult to do. We talk about things like capitalism or socialism or communism or democracy or whatever, any kind of ideology, and we talk about like it exists in the abstract, like, oh, here's the ideas of communism, here's the ideas of democracy, here's the ideas of capitalism, right? And we talk about them like these abstract ideas that float kind of in the ether, right? And I'm like, well, that's not true. These ideas have to be manifested somewhere in some country by some people. So let's imagine a world where there's no democracies, right? Every country is a monarchy or something like that, with the exception of Russia, right? And everything else is basically the same. At least Russia is different. Russia is basically the same as it is now. It's a democracy and Putin's in charge, and the rest of the country are monarchies. If we lived in this world and we were, you know, monarchists essentially, and we had like our respective kings, we would look at Russia and like, wow, democracy is a total scam. Democracy is just one guy, you know, elected, but really he's been elected for like since the 90s, and he actually runs the entire thing. And we would conclude democracy is a terrible idea. Like, if Russia is the only example of democracy in the world, you would conclude, I think quite rightfully, but it's a total scam, right? But but we don't. We live in a world where there's other examples of democracies that are much more functional, not necessarily functional, but more honest, I guess you could say, than the Russian system. But if you look at like Russian history, you look at, you know, Putin, who's been president of Russia since like the 90s. He was actually the second president of Russia after Yeltsin, I think, and he's been basically the second president of Russia with like little thing with Mendeleev for a while since the 90s. This dude's been like the man since in the 1990s. And so you can argue maybe he's a dictator, but at least he's a strong man, right? He's a strong man running the system. And you look during the Soviet Union, what ran Russia, what ran the Soviet Union? It was strong men, Stalin being the most obvious one. It's a strong, powerful leader, right? And you look like an autocratic leader, and you look before that during the Tsarist era, what do they have? They have a strong, powerful leader. So I argue one characteristic of the Russian people, at least the way their governments seem to be, the way they seem to like things, the way things seem to play out, is they have a strong authoritarian leader. That's just how it is. And so if you take any system, whether it's a capitalist democracy or a czarist monarchy or you know, totalitarian communism, when the Russians are manifesting that, they're always going to have one guy in charge, like kind of it. If you also look at places like China, China is also a very authoritarian country, but I think it's been authoritarian for a while. It's not necessarily. I mean, I think things got worse under the communists, fair enough, but it's not just manifesting communism, it's manifesting Chinese communism, kind of like how the Soviet Union was manifesting Russian communism. And if communism, I'm not a fan of communism, but if it was to arise in a place like France, it would be very different, right, than like the communism you saw in the Soviet Union. So it's important. So my kind of the conclusion to my rant, so to speak, is that different ideologies don't exist in the ether. They have to be inhabited by a nation, and they'll have different characteristics of it. And also different people have a way of doing things, and I'm not saying these ways are good or bad, that's just kind of how it is. Like Western Europeans and Americans and Canadians are kind of chaotic, right? Their societies are in many ways more chaotic. Not as chaotic as like African societies, but in some ways it's chaotic. While Eastern societies are more authoritarian, right? It tends to boil down to having one guy in charge, and you have extreme cases where it's not great, like North Korea, but that's just kind of the way they do things. That's just how they are, so to speak. That's just how their system works, and it's got advantages and it's got disadvantages. I'm not saying they're all morally. I'm not making a morally relativist argument saying, "Oh, all forms of government are equally valid." Like, no. Some forms of government are clearly worse than others. Like, let's not play games. Like, some things are trash, but it's more complicated than, oh, this is good and this is bad. You have to take the context of the people into account.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really interesting that and it's really true that I like how you say that it's embodied by the culture that's running that thing. Like your example of France being communist would be different than you've seen it, in other nations, and then the way that but we try to boil it to a general term that fits for everything, and a lot of times it loses its effectiveness in communication by doing that. We think that it'll boil down and be transferable. When I say it this way, it means it's that way for everything, and you're like, well, context is really important in that sense. It's like it's going to change the way that you view that word being used. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And even the fact that we use the word communist that way is because of our context. Like, we live in the shadow of the Cold War. The Cold War only ended like in 1991 or 1990 or something like that. I think it was 91. Yeah, like, it's relatively recent. Like, our generation didn't really know it, or if we were, like, our generation, like, I was born in 1990. So, like, the Cold War had just ended. And if you're a bit older, you were born during the Cold War, but, like, you were a kid, so you remember absolutely nothing. So, but our world exists in the shadow of it. And we kind of forget that from, like, the end of World War II to when we were born, the West, or more specifically, I say the democratic capitalist West, was just locked in, like, this eternal struggle, so it would seem like it, versus the communist East. And so the Americans' idea of we need to just contain like a domino theory, the idea of we need to contain communism everywhere. So one thing that was interesting is the way we remember history is often wrong, because we see history in a way which is self-benefiting to us, and we kind of see it through our lens. Like, people seem to forget that, at least from kind of what I've read, a lot of people thought that the communists were going to win the Cold War. Like, it seemed kind of self-obvious for a certain point. Like, oh yeah, the Russians are totally going to win. Like, we're all screwed. That is it. Because if you look at economic growth of the Soviet Union versus the United States in, like, right after World War II, America and Western countries' growth is kind of like this. Well, the Soviet Union's growth was like that. Like, it was a rocket. Like, at the same time, Russia was a really backwater country, so it's easier to get from 0 to 10 than it is to get from 10 to 12. But their economic growth was enormous. At the beginning of the space race, the Soviets were just dominating the Americans. Like, the Americans don't like to remember that, but it was when Sputnik 2 went into space with, I think it was Laika, the little dog. When she went into space, that's when the Americans founded NASA, because they were terrified. Because it's like, oh, Sputnik, it means like traveler or friend or something like that. Like, Sputnik is literally a hollowed out missile casing, right? Like, the Russians have launched a missile into space. If this doesn't terrify the hell out of you, like, you're an idiot. And so the Americans freaked the hell out, and they built NASA, and they just went, like, they went, like, balls to the wall afterwards, and eventually caught up. And like in 1950 and something, like a huge percentage of the world was under a communist state. So you look at, China, you look at Russia, these are enormous countries, right? And more countries, it's seemingly every day, were turning over to the communist ideology. And so from the context of people living during, I'd say, the early parts of the Cold War, the idea that the Soviets or communism in a sense could win, and that it was an alien economic and social system which was challenging what we kind of had in the West. But the fact that this thing could win wasn't, I think for a lot of people, wasn't necessarily a possibility, but it seemed like a probability. In fact, a lot of Westerners, and again, we forget this, a lot of Westerners said, oh, maybe we should adopt a more Soviet-style economic model, because their growth needs to be a lot faster than ours. I mean, eventually we realized that like the Soviets were all bluffing, and the Americans outspent them, and the house of cards kept falling, just fell down to pieces. And we were like, oh, see, communism is nonsense, right? But that's kind of a conclusion we drew after the fact. But during the actual Cold War in the beginning, people had a very different view. And a lot of science fiction from like Asimov science fiction style stuff from the 50s, the way they reconcile the Cold War is that in the end, both systems would just kind of merge together in this sort of like transhumanist high-tech future. They didn't necessarily see that one day the Soviet Union would, I mean, some people saw this, of course, but it wasn't necessarily a universal view, I think, that the Soviet Union would actually fall one day, as it did, because they seemed like unstoppable at a certain point. So our view of history, I think, is very different from how we remember it. We remember it in a way which is very colored by our popular media. Like, one thing I say is, like, a lot of people, they'll go watch Star Wars and they think that's like World War II. Because Star Wars is actually based off World War II. A lot of aspects of it were, like, obviously, with like the Empire and all that. But they'll look at Star Wars, which is like a kid's movie. It's not even a very good one. And they'll use that as the lens to see through like World War II. I'm like, no, the actuality is way, way, way more complicated and much different. We didn't have Death Stars for one. And we didn't have cool laser swords. So in all sense, it's way lamer. Yeah, I think popular media and our popular conceptions and our popular contemporary moral structures and ideas highly color the way we see history. A lot. So we don't actually remember seeing. I don't know if we actually remember things as accurately as people back then saw it.
Right, and we also apply this new context of today to something that wasn't even possible. Like the thought process that we've evolved to put back into a previous time is not actually possible. And so like it's not true context when we're applying today's current context.
Yeah, it's very anachronistic. But this isn't a new thing. This is like, it's not a new phenomenon, because I saw a painting. I saw a photo of painting on my computer. I didn't see the actual painting from the medieval Europe. So I think maybe like 1500s or something. And it was a painting of Aristotle, right? The ancient Greek philosopher. But instead of painting him like an ancient Greek philosopher, which is probably like some old Greek-looking guy in a toga or a robe or something, they paint him to look like someone from the 15th century. Like he's wearing the clothes of someone from the 15th century. I'm like, well, Aristotle clearly did not dress like someone from the 15th century. So the sense of anachronism, and I'm not expecting anyone, and taking past sorry, I'll be right back. I don't know.
No, you're good.
This is why I don't have friends. They're always bothering you. Hi. Oh, arigatou gozaimasu. Arigatou gozaimasu. We just got a letter. We just got a letter. We just got a letter. I wonder who it's from. It is from the Tokyo Regional Immigration Services Bureau. They spelled my name wrong. So it's Jodan. Because they don't have R's in Japanese. I'm not sure if you can see it, but
Jodan.
Yeah, they don't have R's in Japanese, so they call me Jodan. Like, hello, what's your name? Like, my name's Jodan, which apparently means joker in Japanese, or joke. My name means joke. Interestingly, is they have a little seal, as you can see, a little ink seal on the letter.
Yeah.
The Japanese are huge into ink seals. It's called a hanko. There's a different one. I think hanko is the main one. And in a lot of official documents, you have your personal seal, and you must put it in ink, and you must, it's how you sign. They're very big on that. It's very,
very interesting.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll open this later. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
But yeah, this idea of anachronicity, and also it ties me to another idea, which I was thinking of, is applying contemporary values to the past. It's a tricky bit. At the same time, you do want to judge the past, and you want to learn from the mistakes people made in the past. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the times when people judge the past, especially people who are deemed to be great, not necessarily good, but like influential and significant. So by that definition, someone like Stalin would be great. Not saying he did what is good. I'm saying he changed the world, right, for good or bad. A lot of people will rage on the past to make themselves feel better now, which is an idea I've been kind of playing with for a while. So I think it was George Orwell in like the 40s or something. So George Orwell was himself a socialist, but didn't like the socialist political parties, right? And certainly did not like the Soviet Union at all. And I think Orwell said something along the lines of, the problem with socialists isn't that they love the poor, it's that they hate the rich, right? And so they're just resentful at these people because they have more than them. Because there's always someone who's, no matter how rich you are, there's always someone who's richer than you, unless you're Jeff Bezos or something, right? There's always someone who's got exponentially more than you. That's how the world works. Just get over it. No matter how much you make, there's always someone who's 10 times more than you. And so there's this resentfulness against people who have more, but you can't directly attack them. So you kind of go through a proxy of, pretending to care about the downtrodden. So this idea I've been thinking about for a while. It's not new. Like Orwell wrote about it like in the 40s and stuff. And he probably wasn't even the first one to invent it. Maybe it's been around for hundreds of years or maybe thousands. I don't know. But one thing I was thinking of when I was looking at the videos of the protests and stuff in the United States, where some people were attacking statues of like Thomas Jefferson, and I'm not sure if they were attacking Washington or not, but that wouldn't surprise me. But they were going after these statues of like these great men, right? Like great men of American history. And I thought it struck me a bit strange. I'm like, this seems very weird. Like, I'm not saying some of the things these guys did was really bad by our modern concepts. Fair enough. But the idea of taking down a statue to me has always been weird because it always has like this sense of like erasing the past. Because like in my view, a statue doesn't necessarily mean that this person is good. It means this person was significant. It's like if you're reading a book and there's a significant chapter, you take out a pen and you underline it, or you highlight it or something. It doesn't mean it's necessarily good or bad. It's saying, this is important, pay attention, we're going to put a little star next to this, we're going to put a little footnote next to this. This was important and significant. So I don't necessarily view a statue as necessarily honoring something or saying it's bad. It's just matter-of-factly, hey, this thing, this event, or this person was significant. So pay attention, you might learn something. But specifically, you have a lot of people like trying to tear down these statues and stuff, and I was kind of thinking about it. And the idea, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but I am playing with the idea in my head, is that I think a lot of these people who go after these statues, to put it bluntly, they don't have a whole lot going on, right? Like, they don't necessarily have particularly interesting jobs, and maybe they're not particularly athletic, and maybe they're not particularly attractive. Like, they don't necessarily they're not too high up in the totem pole, so to speak, of not just our society, but probably any society in general. They're not doing too hot, right? And so if you're someone who's kind of down here and you have a you have a symbol of greatness in front of you. You have someone who's so overwhelmingly, not necessarily morally better, but greater than you are. It's like staring into the sun, right? Or it's like trying to look up, it's like trying to look upon the face of God. It's just, you're so overwhelmed by the gap, right? Like, it makes you realize how large the gap is between someone like them, or at least the idea we have of someone like them, which is probably embellished based upon, as opposed to who they actually were. The gap between the perception of the greatness of this dude and yourself is so large, right? Because this person did so much and you did so little, that in a sense, to try and rebalance yourself, you have to, in some way, in some dimension, claim superiority over them. Right? Like, this person was great, and this person founded the United States, or this person discovered America, or something, right? And I'm don't got a whole lot going on, but so I'm not as great as you, but I am morally superior. I have better moral judgments than you because you mistreated the natives, or you owned slaves, or you did some other naughty things. It's a way for, I don't think anyone's like doing this consciously. I think it's mostly like a subconscious kind of process. It is a way of feeling good about yourself when you're in the face of something this large. And so you're taking contemporary moral judgments, and you're sort of using it to take a great person and throw them down, right? And to make yourself feel better in the process, like, oh, I'm not great, I'm not smart, or I didn't discover America, but hey, I am moral, I am good. And so when you literally take the person's statue down, I think it's sort of like I guess metaphysical would be the word. It's like a metaphysical manifestation of taking their idea down and just smashing it.
I don't think so. I think
manifesting you're attempting to manifest your own goodness.
I don't think so. I think it's coming from a place of, I mean, think about this. Like, we just, we had July 4th celebrating independence. Imagine Independence Day happening and you're not independent. Like, you're still a slave for decades after this declaration that America is free. And for decades, you're not even seen as a person. And I think that's what these are coming from. It's to say that they had the chance to make, I mean, they even declared it like all men are created equal. Like, we are, our pursuit of happiness. But when they say that, this group of people, of Black Americans, they didn't view as people. And I think it's more to say
3/5 of people, depending on when it was convenient. I found the 3/5 compromise to me is just like ironically hilarious, because it's like, okay, these are the slave caste. Are they people? They are not people. Okay, we're going to assign voting power in the central government based upon population. In that case, you're like, actually, they are people. Like, it's this weird juxtaposition where they're not people when we can treat them like cattle, right? But they are people when it's in our benefit to gain like a population.
Honestly, I think
it's messed up, but it's really funny.
But I think that's really what the taking down the statues and a lot of the conversation is about. It's about saying like the symbol that they stand for was that hypocrisy of doing exactly that, of like, you're not people, but we'll take advantage of you and benefit from you, but not count you as individuals unless it benefits us. And it's that, and what we're seeing is like, there's so much of that still in the American culture, and it's a call to say like, that's not okay. Like, we're not all right with that happening. And I don't think it's a call to say like they're not great people. It's that we have to acknowledge that these things can't continue to go on. Like, we acknowledge like the past is the past and we're not changing it. But in order to create the future and to challenge the belief systems that we have, to make it in a way that makes it possible to possibly have a chance to catch up and to right the wrongs that have happened. I think it's that's the bigger message that I think that they're trying to say. I don't think it's just because they don't have any jobs or that they don't have or that they're wanting to think that they're better. I think they've been hurting, and we're trying to create a culture that values all people and doesn't hold up ideas of people that in the shadows directly were against like not moral right, but like human rights, like just decency of treating people as people. I think that's really the message that's trying to be said.
I think that's what they are consciously thinking, but they're basing that off basically a very limited view of history, right? Like, so this idea, for example, of like the slave or enslaved people fighting for freedom. There's only 2 countries in the world that actually happened. There's only 2 countries in the entire world that fought a war to end slavery. The United States was one, obviously. Do you know what the second one was?
No.
It's Haiti, actually, or Saint Dominic, as it used to be called. It used to be called Saint Dominique. It was a French colony, and Haiti had a civil war over the issue of slavery. But these are the only 2 countries in the world that have fought a war for slavery. And I find slavery is fascinating because this might be controversial, but I argue that, and I want to be very precise with my words here, I think slavery is natural in the sense that animals will do it. I don't say natural because people think natural means good. I'm saying natural is just how the world will be if humans don't really do stuff, right? If humans don't build systems or ideas and stuff. Because slavery exists within animals. So monkeys will do it. I'm not sure if tribes is the right term, but monkey groups, clans, I don't know how monkeys organize themselves. I don't know if they have a king. Maybe they are a monarchy. I don't know if monkeys or certain types of monkeys or apes, I don't remember, will do it. Ants will enslave other ants. And the reality of slavery has been true for the grand majority of human history, right? And so the fact that we live in a world which doesn't have slavery, to me, is actually very surprising. Like, we take it as like a moral, oh, it's perfectly obvious that slavery is wrong. And I'm like, no, it's not morally obvious at all. It's a huge revelation. It's like the invention of like the number 0. Like, this is not obvious at all to have a concept of a number 0, but it's so powerful once you do. And I think this idea that slavery is morally bad is a relatively new idea in the world, but we kind of see history through this lens of we're kind of judging everyone, but it's relatively recent. Like, I mean, slavery is in like the Old Testament, right? And it's been a reality in the world up until recently. And the actualities. That's my first point. And secondly, when Americans think about like slavery, they only think about slavery in the United States in general, because Americans tend to have a relatively narrow view of world history. They only kind of see the 200, 300 years or so. I think it was 250. I don't remember. So I think slavery in America, I think it wasn't legal until like 1600 or something like that. What's interesting is the first person who owned apparently a slave in the United States was a black guy. Because it wasn't just like, oh, we'll have slavery. It was a transitionary system, like not the advent, but the implementation of history in the United States. And so my point is that Americans will see slavery through the lens of American history. I'm like, yeah, obviously that happened. You have to take that into account. But more accurate view is you want to see slavery as a global phenomena over thousands of years, because that gives you a more complete, view of it. Now, one thing which is interesting, I learned this a while ago, and it kind of blew my mind, because it's crazy, and I checked, it's true. And it also blew my mind that no one actually knows it. So 2 countries in the world ended slavery through a war, civil war. Almost every other country in the world that ended slavery did it through a treaty, right? And there's one historical organization, a very powerful historical organization that you've heard of, which was the co-signer on the overwhelming, I think, the majority of these treaties. Right? What was this organization is the first question. And if you don't know, think, why do you not know what this organization is? Because if there is an organization in history which ended slavery in the vast majority of the world, you'd think we'd remember, right? You'd think there'd be like a statue or 2 of that. But there isn't. We don't remember it, which I find is kind of interesting. Like, why don't we emphasize that? But my first question is, what is this organization? And it's not like some weird thing you've never heard. Okay. Well, take a guess. It's a large organization. It's, I'm being vague of organization because I'm not making it clear what kind of organization it is. It's a huge organization which had a massive amount of influence in the world.
I honestly have no idea.
It was the British Empire.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, the British Empire ended slavery globally. And actually, if the United States didn't rebel against the British Empire, they would have ended slavery before. They wouldn't have had the Civil War. I mean, maybe they would have fought it over some other reason, but they wouldn't have had a civil war for the sake of slavery, because the British Empire ended slavery way before the United States did. The Americans were like 20, more like 50 years behind in that regard. But no, it was the British Empire. And I was like, this is insane. Like, how is the British Empire the bad guys, right? And so I started reading a bit more about it. So what happened, here's the basic story of how slavery ended in the modern world. And why I personally contributed to it more than anyone else. Not anyone else, but more than most people. And I demand a statue of my own. I will get into that.
Okay.
I mean, that part's a bit facetious, but I'll get into that. So the basic story is it takes place in the American Civil War was like 1850, right? Yeah, around 1850. So it was in the early 1800s. And there was a British dude, this was his real name, called Wilberforce. That's his actual name. And he was, I think, like an upper class member of British society. And he joined Parliament, because that's what upper class members of British society did. In the early, I think late 1700s, early 1800s kind of deal. And then he was traveling Europe one day, and traveling Europe and Asia and I think Africa, because he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life, apparently. And he had like sort of a revelation or a vision, so to speak, that what I will do is I will get rid of slavery, right? Because a lot of people back then knew that slavery was a bad thing. Like even the founding fathers saw slavery as a compromise. They're not like, oh yeah, slavery is awesome. A lot of them were like, this isn't great, but if we take it out, we can't form our country because half the country is going to leave. Like everything in the world is a compromise, right? It's nice to be idealist, but realistically, everything's a compromise, whether you want it or not. That's just how the world is, for good or bad. And so he had like a sort of like a vision, so to speak. And I didn't want to read more about this guy. He probably has an autobiography. He's like, what I will do with my life is I will end slavery. And so the dude became an evangelical Christian. And when he went back to Parliament in England, he lobbied Parliament to ban slavery. And so like every year or every other year, this guy would introduce a bill saying we need to get rid of slavery. And everyone's like, no. Because you had various economic interests that didn't want it to ban slavery, right? British Empire was the largest slave-owning entity in the world. There was like North African slave merchants who didn't, you should say no more slavery, well, there goes business. And there was a lot of like, British, and I guess industrialists would be the term, who relied on slave labor. It's like, dude, if you get rid of this thing, like our entire thing's going to blow up. Like it's not going to happen. And so the dude for every year, or every year kept, and there was a huge list of all the attempted bills. He would keep lobbying. It's like the one guy every year who keeps bringing up the same idea over and over. He kept lobbying over and over. Like, we need to get rid of the slave trade. We need to get rid of the slave trade. We need to get rid of the slave trade. Eventually, not sure exactly what happened, but his coalition, his anti-slavery coalition got enough political power in, I think it was like 1820 or something like that, early 1800s, that they passed the British Slave Trade Act, which banned the slave trade in the British Empire. Now, slavery was still legal, but you couldn't buy any more slaves. You couldn't like import any more slaves. So the system was frozen, and that was the first step. And then they passed subsequent legislation to ban slavery altogether. And this was basically Wilberforce's entire life, was just petitioning Parliament over this one issue. And I think the British Slave Trade Act was passed, and the guy died like 6 months later or something like that. Like that was basically his thing. That was like the guy championed this thing like his entire life. And so the British Empire, being the most powerful and largest empire in history, once it banned slavery inside itself, well, there goes a lot of slavery in the world. And because at this time, European colonial powers have a military advantage over, enormous military advantage over most other parts of the world, the British kindly asked, in question, other like smaller nations if they would kindly also get rid of slavery, right? Because if a British Empire shows up a bunch of gunships to your little like African village and they tell you, hey, you guys should ban slavery, you're not going to say no. And so ironically, it was the countries like France and the United States that had more power. I mean, if it came to like the British weren't going to like fight France and America to get rid of their slavery, but it's the countries that had enough power to resist the British Empire, and also parts of the world that were more foreign and remote, but European colonialism couldn't really access, like the inner parts of Africa and certain parts of Asia. Those were the ones where slavery lasted longer. So I was in Singapore like last year or so, and Singapore was founded as a British colony. And when the British landed in Singapore, well, there was already natives living there. It was predominantly like Malay kings controlled the area. And the British said, you cannot have slavery anymore. And the Malay king's like, what the hell, dude? We've had slavery forever. This is our jam, man. This is just the way the world is. This is normal. This is natural. And the British, like, yes, that's very nice. It's very nice, but we have way more guns than you. So do what we say. And so that was I can't remember his name, but that was the British commander who sort of landed in the area, said no slavery, and then he left, went back to England. And the commander after him, to try and make peace with the locals, was like, okay, fine, you can keep slavery for a little bit longer. And they actually got rid of it in Singapore a bit later. Same thing in Thailand. Like, Thailand was never colonized by Europeans, but the European powers convinced the Thais to also get rid of slavery. And so, one, I think most people aren't very much aware of this, and because they'll say stuff like, oh, European colonialism and slavery. I'm like, these two things are actually opposed, because the more an area was under European colonial influence, the less the area had slaves. And the areas which were further away had slavery no longer. So Mauritania, which is a country, I think, in East Africa, had slavery till 1990. Not 1890, which is already really late, which is already like you're like 150 years behind. 1990 is when slavery was made illegal. And no one was actually persecuted for slavery until the year 2000, right? So so my point is that it was European colonialism, specifically British colonialism, that ended slavery in the world. And because the British Empire was so overwhelmingly overpowered compared to basically all the natives, if you look at like the treaties that ended slavery in lots of parts of the world, the British Empire is a co-signer.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think, and this is kind of interesting, but had European colonialism not existed, I think it's highly probable we'd still be living in a world of slavery, or at least a lot more slavery than we have now. Again, it's because people have an understanding of history, but they have a very narrow understanding of history. So you went to school in the States, right? So you're probably familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, where the Europeans and stuff would go down to Africa, West Africa. They would buy slaves there, and then they would bring the slaves to America, and then they would get like cotton and other goods from America, and then they would go back to Europe to sell them. Like the South provided like I think half the world's cotton, or like 40% of the world's cotton at one point, like something crazy. Like King Cotton was like not wrong. The South produced a crazy amount of cotton, and then they would go back to Europe, and they would like sell the raw materials and all that. It was kind of a triangle, and that's true. That happened. Of the slaves that left Africa, what percentage do you think went to the United States?
I have no idea.
It was around 3%. So I think it was around 3% of the slaves that were taken from West Africa, which is where most of the African slaves came from, went to Africa. A lot of them went to South America, where they weren't farmers, but they were miners. And a lot of them as well were taken up through Africa to the Maghreb. That's North Africa, where like the Arabs and stuff lived. And so they would just kind of march them through the desert, and all of them died, right? North through Africa to the Maghreb, where the female slaves would serve as basically prostitutes, to put it bluntly. And a lot of the male slaves were used as harem guards, right? So the harem is the part of, I think the literal definition, I think we kind of like romanticize it, but the literal definition of the harem, I think, is the area of a Muslim household where women stay. It doesn't necessarily have like a sexual, oh, my harem of women connotation. I think that's kind of like Westerners romanticizing it a little bit. But a lot of the male African slaves who went up to North Africa became eunuchs, chop chop, and they were the guards of the harem. So now you understand why they were eunuchs. And part of the reason why not that many slaves went into the United States is that while farming is, in the hot sun's not great, it probably won't kill you, right? You probably will not die from picking cotton. While if you're a eunuch, you're not going to reproduce, and you don't want to necessarily know what they did with the children of the African prostitutes who were in North Africa. And a lot of the slaves in South America in the mines, like these were shitty mines in the late 1700s. They collapsed all the time. So the death rate was super high. So part of the reason why the United States had a relatively low importation percentage of slaves is because the slave population managed to, for good or bad, managed to reproduce, right? And actually the slaves forming families and forming bonds was in a sense a form of like rebellion against their status as objects, or the status as like beasts of burden, right? It's like, yeah, you might think I'm an animal, but I still have a family and I still have children. And some of the nicer slave owners, like Washington, was like, yes, you guys should get married and you should have children. You should try and form a community, right? While some of the more dickish ones were like, yeah, I don't recognize your marriage, so your wife is, I'm going to sell her to this guy over there, right? So a lot of marriages were actually broken up through the selling of slaves in America. While the more enlightened slave owners like Washington were like, no, this is good and proper. And I think he officiated on some slave's wedding, but I'm not too sure about that. And additionally, at this point, a lot of the slavery in the world was like West Africans being kind of shipped out to other parts. But before that, a lot of slavery in the world. So that's my first point. And secondly, this idea that slavery has a racial or a racist connotation is a relatively new idea in the world. So you look at like the Roman Empire, they had a lot of slaves. And for the most part of history, I think that if you had a slave, they looked like you, right? Because imagine you're some random dude in, I don't know, some part of Germany. Well, there's no Germany back then, but you're a Germanic person, and your tribe fights that tribe over there, and you take slaves. Well, they're the tribe next to you, so they're going to look like you, right? So there's not necessarily a racist or a racial, more precisely, aspect to slavery, because like the ability to go halfway around the world and to take people from one place around the world and bring them here is technologically incredibly complicated, and you're not going to be able to do that for like the grand majority of human history. You're going to enslave the tribe next to you that's weaker, right? And they're going to look probably like you because of the world's your world is much smaller back then. And the idea of this idea of slavery having always a racist connotation or a racial connotation, I don't think is true. I think that was the case in the United States, and the Americans have kind of projected that globally under their global understanding of slavery. I'm like, no, slavery is just about domination, dude.
But I think what they're projecting, or what the message is really about, is how we've taken American people and took their rights. And that, right? I see the message that you're saying is like when you look at history and a lot of these other things, but really what the argument that's happening is saying, look, the system, it's not even about what happened before. I mean, that's like part of it's about saying that yes, that did happen, but it's not about history. It's about what's happening now. Is that racism is still here, and this concept of thinking that a person or a race or a color or anything is lesser of a person. That notion, it has not been taken out of our culture yet. And I think that's what, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, I think I think you hear a lot of people, and my family says this a lot, of like, well, all lives matter. And it's like, yes, like all lives matter, and because all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, because these are the ones that what's that?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think the slogan Black Lives Matter is a very brilliant slogan. It's like Make America Great Again. That's a really good, like, whether you agree with it or not, it's a brilliant slogan. Like, Make America Great Again is a brilliant slogan. Black Lives Matter is a brilliant slogan. What was Hillary Clinton's slogan? I'm with her. This is a terrible slogan. This is the worst slogan in the world. That's part of the reason why she lost. Her slogan was trash. I don't know what Joe Biden's slogan is going to be, but it should be. I hope he makes it a good one, because it's a good slogan is one that you can't really disagree with, at least at face value. Like, Make America Great Again. Some things in the past were better than they were now. Like, yeah, that's fair. And we will make America great again. We will restore our former glory. Like, you can't disagree with that. Like, you want to make America worse? What are you arguing? Like, same thing with Black Lives Matter. Like, what's the counterpoint? Black lives don't matter? Like, what the hell kind of opinion is that?
That's the funny thing when people try to say, well, I think all lives matter. It's like, yeah, we're on the same page. We're not, it's not a counter argument to Black Lives Matter, but they're using it as if it is.
Yeah, but again, this idea of rights is a Western concept. And this idea of, like, civil rights, or the rights of, so one thing I've observed since like kind of studying the Western history and also studying contemporary Westerners is Westerners are for good or bad, they're universalists. Right? They are a universalist people, but they're not aware of their universalist people. One, because they don't know what that means. Two, they think everyone else is a universalist people. No, they're not. And three, they think, well, it's kind of the same thing as two. They think universalism is normal. So what I mean by universalism is you're interested in the, not global justice, but in rules that are the same for everyone, right? So if you look at a lot of the documents and ideas that are very popular, that either come from the West or are very popular in the West, you look at like, the American Declaration of Independence, you look at the Declarations of the Rights of Man in France, which was inspired by the American Declaration of Independence, you look at a lot of the ideas of Christianity in the West, there's a universalist message here. It's not, our group has special rights and privileges and you people can all go to hell. It's universalist. These are the rights of man, global. It's a universalist view. And Westerners are very interested in universalist value systems, right? Because that's what they believe to be fair. They're like, no, it's not fair if you just, have one set of rules for people of one skin color and another set of rules for people of a skin color. That's not good. They're fundamentally universalists. And so Westerners will look back upon like the discriminatory legal policies and practices in the West, and they're like, oh, this is so bad and this is horrible. But what Westerners don't understand is the reason they got rid of these practices in the first place is because they have an underlying sense of universalism. Like if they didn't have this universalist worldview, they wouldn't see anything wrong with these practices. And so what I find one irony of like the West is that it whips itself on the back so much for discrimination, but it's the least discriminatory part of the world. Like the West has done more for civil rights than any other part of the world. This is simply like, you can't argue it. It's like the gap is too enormous. It's too large. Like when some people, and it's not a similar argument,
but isn't that a connection with being able to like because it has to do with also self-organizing and being able to like create the sum of our parts is better than the individuals, right? So it's like it's part of how we're able to elevate some of those pieces, is that we've been able to get to a place where we're able to go, hey, wait, some of these things are wrong, whereas other people, it's that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like a lot of people don't get to that place where they don't worry about food. And so if you don't ever get past that, then you're not able to start going, maybe there's more than just getting food. Is that what I'm saying? Do you think it's because we've been able to create societies that function, that allow you to, like, I don't have to farm to get my food. I could do this other thing, get money that allows me to do this. And it frees me to have thought. Right.
I don't know. I think I guess I half agree. On one point, you have to then ask, okay, but in that case, why did this society get to the point where they kind of climb to the top of Maslow's hierarchy? Like, why did this society happen to do that? And two, I think it's more of a function of culture rather than economics. So one view a lot of Westerners have is, oh, well, some parts of the world are dishonest and they're corrupt, and that's because they're poor. They're poor, these people don't have a lot of opportunities, so they're going to be corrupt and all that, and so their corruption is excusable as a means to try and elevate their status. And we have the model that people's culture, so to speak, or their MO, is a function of, among other things, the economic situation. But the more I've traveled, the more I've thought about it, I'm like, I think it might actually be backwards, that the parts of the world that are less corrupt are more likely to become wealthier. And part of my understanding of this is having a better understanding of like Japanese history. So Japan was basically a joke. I mean, not a joke. It was a medieval society up until like 1850, give or take, right? It was closed off. In Western history, we say, oh, Japan was completely closed off from everyone. That's not true. They still traded with China and some of the other Asiatic people. They just weren't very much interested in Westerners. They're like, no, you people can stay over there. Thank you very much. Right, the Japanese were a closed-off people, and the Americans under Commodore Matthew Perry, who later became that character on that French show, showed up with large ships to Japan and kindly asked the Japanese, it's called gunboat diplomacy, if they would like to open up ports to trade with the Westerners, because the Westerners were always looking, because they had, the economic boon and all that, Industrial Revolution, they were always looking for new markets to sell stuff, and they wanted to buy certain goods that you could only get in certain parts of the world, like China. I'm not sure if we still use that word now, but China it means the country, but it also means like cups and like plates. Right? This is called China, and the reason it's called China is because it comes from China historically, and up until like relatively recent history, the Chinese and also the Japanese produced much better bowls and cups and plates than the Westerners could. We didn't really know how to do it, and to the point like our cups were so crappy that some people in England, what they do when they pour tea is they pour cold milk, and then they pour the hot tea into their cup. They don't pour the hot tea in and then the milk. Why? Because if you do that, the hot tea will break the glass. Not the glass, it'll break the container. Because they couldn't figure out how to make a cup that wouldn't break under hot water, which sounds insane nowadays because we're used to all like these really fancy plastics to do whatever the hell we want. But it's not the way it was back then. So if you wanted something as simple as a cup which wouldn't break when you pour hot water into it, you got to get it from China, which of course kept the manufacturing secrets, to themselves. So Westerners wanted that, and Japan also produced a lot of these types of goods as well. Westerners wanted that, and their technological level, like blasted, was way ahead of the Japanese. Like these people had like bows and arrows and swords, right? And so the Westerners showed with like steamships and cannons, and the Japanese were like, "Oh my God, we are so backwards. We are like, imagine aliens landing one day with like laser weapons. That's the equivalent. They're like, we are such a backwards people. We are so screwed. The way the world is going, you're either going to be colonized or you're going to be a colonizer, and we want to be option B." So in like basically 50 or 70 years, Japan went from essentially a medieval society. And if you look at old photographs of Edo, which is what Tokyo used to be, I'm not sure if they called it Tokyo this time period, like what Japan used to be, it's a bunch of like not mud, but it's like, wooden houses and people walking around in kimonos and like, katanas and stuff like that. They did that, and within like roughly 50 years, from like when the Americans landed to the early 1900s, they became the most powerful empire in Asia. And in like the early 1900s, they fought the Russians and they won. This shocked, like we forgot about the Russian-Sino War. Actually, Theodore Roosevelt, American president, was the first American president to win a Nobel Peace Prize because he actually negotiated a truce to end the war. So he actually got it for something legitimate, as opposed to Obama, who got it for no reason whatsoever, apart from not being Bush. But like showing you how low standards have fallen. Like, yeah, how do you get a peace prize? I negotiate the end to a global war. That's good. So the Japanese blasted the Russians in like the 1905 war, and it shocked the entire world because the world was way more racist back then than it is now. And the idea that an Asian foreign barbarian people could defeat like a white European people, even if it was the Russians and they were kind of backwards, was just incomprehensible. It was insane. And they managed to do this in 50 years. And then you give them like another while, and they start then you have the Japanese Empire, and they managed to start colonizing a lot of parts of Asia. Right? They colonized Taiwan and Korea and parts of China. And eventually they try and attack the United States. And they have balls enough to attack the United States. It doesn't end very well for them, but they go from less than 100 years from medieval to the most powerful empire in this part of the world, and they're attacking the Americans. Like, I'm not saying what the Japanese Empire did was moral or just. I'm saying they got shit done. Like, they hustled, right? The Japanese are very hard, have an impossible capacity for hard work. They're not creative. They have no individual initiative whatsoever. They're like little ants, but they just shut up and they do what they're told. And their strategy is step 1, shut the hell up. Step 2, work harder. And if you do that, you can build an empire that can stand up against like Western empires in a very short amount of time. It's very impressive. Now, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. If you actually look at a lot of what the Japanese Empire did in East Asia, it was horrible. Way worse than the Nazis, man. Not on the same scale, but like way worse, I would argue. Just less people involved. It was horrible. I'm not justifying it. I'm saying it is impressive that you can go to that level in such a short amount of time. So I think it's more a function of like culture than economics, right? And if the Japanese are kind of more of a laid back, because they have no chill here at all. They don't ever relax. But if they were more of a laid-back people, then the Americans show up like, yeah, man, we'll trade with you, yeah, whatever. Like, there's nothing stopping Japan from just kind of cruise controlling for like 100 or so years, and then you'd come to Japan now, and it would still be kind of like a third world country where, they're just kind of relaxed. So I think it's highly a function of like the culture and the value system of the society. I mean, not exclusively. There's also parameters you have to take into account, but
I think that's a really good I would love to have another discussion about that. I think culture and like the environment, like what you're talking about, I think that does play a big part as like a nation, but then as an individual, like to be able to make that turn from like people that grow up and come from nothing, and how do they make that switch? And I think it does come down to like internal culture, and then culture like Silicon Valley, so like the culture of their or culture of corporations, like there's a lot behind that.
But going back to the so I'm kind of off topic, but the thing with Black Lives Matter is I don't disagree with their slogan at face value or necessarily their message. I think they just have a model of the world where they perceive the West, or America in this case, as a racist, discriminatory system. And I think it's not true at all. Like, it's very much the opposite. Like the West.
I think it's easy to say that because we're white.
No, like, I think you can do it by studying like the values of a different society.
Right, but we also don't like. I think that's the great thing about the Black Lives Matter is like people not talking about their grandparents, being discriminated or their parents, but them, like people our age, like growing up and having countless stories on where they, for the color of their skin, like this isn't about history. Like this is about what's going on right now. And I think the fact that we can have these discussions and say like, I don't think it's that bad. Like part of that is like, we can't deny like we are white. And so we fit in with when you look at like redlining, like nearly only because of the fact that they were colored, like not because they didn't have the money or that they weren't hardworking. It's just simply because of the color of their skin that a group of people decided that they were unable to get loans that white people were able to get. And I think that's the main thing. It's not to say that woe is me. It's to say the system's broken if we're systematically determining these people are not the same as other people, right? And I think that's the bigger thing.
But it should be seen from a perspective where it can be quantified and seen in an objective manner, because this is a very dangerous argument that we're seeing in the West now, and it's not going to end well at all. Like if people keep going down this line of reasoning, it's going to bite us all in the ass. But this idea of you're incapable of comprehending certain ideas because of your skin color is like, that's so toxic. Like if you keep going down that line, you're basically going to get something like Hitler. Like so one thing I've been reading a lot about history recently is the 1920s Germany. And so, the environment that led to Nazi Germany. And so it's like, how do you become a fascist state? Like, how does that actually like work? Like, as you look at like Germany in the 20s and you look at Germany in the 40s, like, well, it's black and white. I mean, yeah, the photos are black and white, but you know what I mean? Like, it's a complete change. How the hell is that possible? And a lot of the way that we remember it is completely wrong. Like a lot of the ways we remember the Weimar Republic, I think is completely inaccurate, and we see it from this kind of like self-serving perspective. But if you see it kind of like in the context of how people saw it then, our current time period is a lot closer to it than people think. So one thing is this view of, well, the Nazis were this totalitarian, violent political party, and that's true. What we don't mention is there was a bunch of violent totalitarian political parties in Germany and all over Europe at the time. The Nazis were just one of them. They're the ones who happened to manage to take control of the government. But you had plenty of extremist left-wing parties. Like Antifa originally was an extremist left-wing party in Germany. That's Antifaschist Action. It's a German word. Like that's where it comes from. And so the Nazis would literally fight the communists and the Antifas in the streets. Like the governments could not maintain control in these areas because they were kind of like weak, I guess. And so you had these political parties which were becoming sort of these paramilitary organizations. The Nazis were one of them, but they weren't the only one. There was other extremist conservative all extreme, I'm not like extremist right wing and extremist liberal parties, and they just like fought all over the country. Like that's what the Spanish Civil War was basically. Like it was the Republicans fighting against the fascists, right? And in Austria, you have the Nazis fighting the fascists, and in so that's one of the things we all so confuse. We think that the Nazis, the National Socialists, and the fascists were the same thing, and that they're basically euphemisms for each other. Like, no, they are not. Now it's true they were both extremist, right-wing political parties. That's true, but and they were often allied together. That's true, but they're not the same. Where we have this kind of view where we take everything that's bad, we'll just put it all in like one bucket and just give it like one label and kick it over there. I'm like, that's really dangerous, because then you don't understand what it is. What you want to do is dissect it and understand the mechanisms behind it, because then you can actually recognize it. Otherwise, you're just like a kid saying, "Oh, this is all bad," and da 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 da. But no, I think that Weimar Germany, there's a lot of correlations from our current United States to Weimar Germany, and I think this idea of, oh, well, if you're white, there's this, you cannot comprehend this. And I'm like, but human understanding has managed to do so much. Like through reason and logic, we've managed to see colors that we can see colors that our eyes can't see. That's essentially what like microwaves are, right? We've managed to land on the moon. We've built like enormous cities. Like our logic, our capability of understanding the world is so powerful that it seems to have, I'm not saying it's limitless or godlike. I'm saying, and that humans don't have, limits on their abilities. They certainly do. And I'm not saying that in some areas some people don't get discriminated. In some areas of life, some people get discriminated, and some people for one way or another. That's true. But this idea that, oh, your argument is invalid because this is an incomprehensible thing to you because I possess some sort of knowledge by virtue of this trait is like, that's so dangerous that this is going to bite everyone in the ass if we keep going down the line of thinking. But going off on that, I think there are areas, for example, in society, which can be quantified, in which you do get a certain advantage if you're one ethnicity or another, or not necessarily ethnicity, because you can label people a multitude of ways. I'm just going to use ethnicity for now. One area which I think is very much the case, and I do believe that white privilege exists in this context, is in dating. Because there's a lot of data to back this up. Like I'm a more scientifically minded person. If you are a white person in this data comes from the United States, but it's probably true for like all of the West and maybe the rest of the world. I don't know. But for now, I'm just focusing on America. If you are a white dude, a man specifically, not white person, but white man, you have an advantage in terms of dating, in terms of how attractive you are perceived by women, money and all that stuff kind of aside. So in order of most privilege to least privilege in terms of dating in the United States, and we're cutting humans into like really big groups here. So I think if you boil down by like sub-ethnicities or nationalities, you might get more granularity. But it basically goes, if I remember, biggest advantage is white in dating. Then it's if you're black. Then it's if you're Hispanic. Then I believe it's East Asian. And I think finally if you're a Middle Eastern man or an Indian man, so South Asian or Middle Eastern, you have the worst. And there's tons of studies, both in terms of like anecdotal, like talking to people, like you have like a really tall, handsome, successful Chinese guy who can't get a date on Tinder. And so both like, talking to people and both in terms of like objective data, like, yeah, there's clearly a pattern here. It's not necessarily the same for women though. While white women have an advantage, apparently Asian women have the largest dating advantage. And you can also break it down by age and income. Like there's a lot of data behind here. So I think the areas of discrimination is where people are discriminated.
I think
it just needs to be like studied.
Well, but I think that's the point that's trying to be made by Black Lives Matter is it isn't just about the fact that they're being discriminated. It's the fact that systems are put up directly to oppress and oppose Black Americans. Like when you look at the war on drugs, like that was directly targeted at Black communities. Like when you look at redlining, it's when we talk about when you're creating a society and you put rules in place by white people to oppress Black people, that and it's not it's I don't think it's them saying like they're just telling their stories in a sense to say, hey, we need a new system, like we need a new belief system, like something is wrong when this is the case, right? So I agree with you saying like there's a lot of areas that we need a lot more data, and I don't know that they would disagree with that. They're pointing out areas that need attention, right? Like these are things that are happening that can't be denied, that behind closed doors we have tapes of presidents saying like, well,
Yeah, Nixon.
you
Yeah, we
can't
got
say the
to.
N-word, so we got to find another way to attack this, right? And
Yeah.
finding loopholes, right?
Yeah,
I think it goes back to what we were talking about on culture. It's about, we need to break down some of these cultures that have been very toxic, that you know, frankly, I haven't had to deal with because I'm not black, and I have been removed from it. It goes back to the ignorance thing. Like I didn't grow up around a lot of black people, so I wasn't faced with a lot of those things. And as you get out into the world, you're like, no, racism doesn't happen. And then you talk to other people and you're like, oh, I just didn't happen because I wasn't around those people, but it for sure is still there.
I agree with you with the underlying state of being, for the most part, but I think the solution that's being pushed by sort of the Black Lives Matter types isn't a very good solution. It's not going to work because it doesn't address not necessarily human nature, but the self-fulfilling prophecies of a lot of these systems. So let's take, for example, like police discrimination, okay? And let's say, for sake of argument, yes, the police do discriminate against black people more, right? Let's not like necessarily worry about the actual data for it. Let's have a thought experiment, and we'll assume that this is true, okay? Just for sake of the argument, right? So let's say you're a police officer, and you have just left the academy, right? You're a brand new police officer, and let's say, for sake of argument, that you don't even comprehend race. You have zero data points about race whatsoever. Now, there's this argument that race is something which is like racism is purely taught, as like how much of racism is taught, how much of it is like inherent human biological tendencies. I think it's kind of a mix of both. Because everything humans do, I argue, is based on top of a biological substrata. I think that's kind of what it all boils down to. There's nothing really. I mean, maybe there's stuff below that, but that's kind of like the funnel it all goes through. But let's say, for sake of argument, you're a perfect little angel, and you have none of these things. If you're a police officer, you don't talk to the nicer parts of society very often, because why would you, right? You're a cop. And you're a police officer, and you're policing an area. And repeatedly, you see that it's young black men over and over, not necessarily the same men, but the same type of people committing crimes. Overwhelmingly, it's this group over and over committing crimes. My point is, even if you don't want to, even if at a conscious level you're trying very hard to say, no, I can't discriminate based upon race, even if you're trying to, subconsciously, you're just going to start doing it because it's the same groups committing crimes over and over again. And because of this, it's going to color your perception of the system, and the system is going to be more discriminatory towards certain groups because it associates these groups with criminality, which normalizes these groups as criminal, which makes them more likely, I think, to engage in this criminal behavior, which reinforces the thing. It's basically like an Ouroboros, right? It's like a snake eating its own tail. And it's not necessarily that, oh, well, from the ether, it's not like a direct arrow down, like, oh, the power structure is discriminating against these people for no reason whatsoever. It's like they're doing it based upon for a reason. Whether it's a right reason or wrong reason is debatable, but there's some sort of reason that's doing it, and which is kind of like giving a feedback loop into it. So some interesting bits on that. So in South Africa, where they had an apartheid system. In their apartheid system, the Japanese counted as white people, which are like, they're not Westerners, right? Like, why would they be white people? Because the Japanese Empire at the time had a really big business deal. They had a huge business deal with South Africans, and I think they were buying resources from South Africa. So I think South Africa has a lot of natural resources, and the Japanese don't have any. And so it was a huge, big dollar business deal over a long period of time. And so the Japanese government, we're going to send some of our guys over to your country to like manage, the affairs of the deal. And the South Africans were like, yeah, sure. And they realized like, oh crap, we can't discriminate against these dudes because it's impractical, right? We can't have like our Western English descendant people and these Japanese dudes eating at two separate lunch counters. If we're trying to make business with them, it's not going to work. It's like, okay, no, the Japanese counter's white. So a lot of it is just practicality, right? It's just
Yeah. Trevor Noah talked about that, about how the Japanese were white, but then Chinese people were considered colored and black, and so that and he's like, I always wondered like how, people that were the police, how are they going to be like, no, you're not, like, how are they really measuring that and stuff? So
it's the word white. The word white is interesting because I was thinking about Westerners and their characteristics, and whatever aspect of the Westerner. One is that Westerners are universalists, and two, it's that Westerners do not see themselves as a people. I always found this kind of peculiar. Like Westerners, the way Westerners see the world, they don't say, okay, here's the world, here's all the different people of the world. We're going to cut the world up into different regions. And so here's the Far East, and here's like the Maghreb, and here's like South Africa, and here's the Hispanic countries. They don't cut it up into a world, into a map, and then draw a big crayon around like, North America and Western Europe and say, oh, well, this is the West, this is us. And we are one of the people of the world. There's multiple peoples or civilizations, I guess we could say, of the world. And we happen to be one of the civilizations of the world. A lot of Westerners, especially Americans, more so than Europeans, they don't really see themselves that way. They see themselves kind of like as the default person, as the standard human, so to speak, and everyone else is just kind of a bit foreign and weird. When a more accurate model is like, no, there's no real, that's like default human. That's kind of an abstract, like, how do you define that? There's just various groups. And it's reinforced a lot in both our language and our behavior. So for example, a lot of Westerners, one, they don't know what the word Westerner means. They definitely don't know what the word Occidental means, which is just another way of saying Westerner. They call themselves white, but in English language anyway, white can also mean vanilla. It can also mean like flavorless or default or non-special, like this norm, right? And so the fact that we use words like, so for example, I was at a grocery store in like the United States at one point, and there was a sign for an aisle that said ethnic food, right? Which it was like Hispanic and black food, right? It was like ethnic food. I'm like, all food is ethnic food. There's no such thing as a non-ethnic food. A non-ethnic food can't exist because all foods are eaten by an ethnicity or maybe multiple ethnicities, right? You can't have non-ethnic food. And I thought that was just the funniest thing in the world, because that effectively what that sign means is that food that white people eat, like steak and potatoes, right, is non-ethnic food. It means essentially that white people are not an ethnicity. I'm like, of course they're an ethnicity. Like, what else the hell would they be? Like, they have to know an ethnicity. And it's in our language, and our culture. Additionally, because Westerners produce so much material culture in the world, and we're like the most powerful and influential part of the world, we kind of live in a world that we've created, so to speak, right? So the clothes we wear are basically evolutions of the clothes that Westerners wore like 100 years ago, right? If you look at like someone in 1800s England, you look at their clothes, you look at our clothes now, you can see the evolution, or arguably the devolution. I think we dress worse than people used to. If you go to a place like Japan, you look at what they used to wear now, their traditional garb, and what they wear now, it's completely different. It's like a step function, and they've adopted a lot of Western mannerisms. They've kind of westernized themselves, / been westernized. Well, Westerners have never been westernized by anyone else because we're the Westerners ourselves. So there's never been like an external kind of alien culture to us that's shown up. Maybe you could argue the Romans, that's shown up to us and kind of says, that is just there, and you're like, oh, this is interesting, and you kind of like assimilate their traits. And we do that a little bit. All cultures exchange ideas all the time, but a lot of it seems to be is just, it's mostly one way of like the West blasting culture out into the rest of the world, and the rest of the world either willingly or unwillingly, but although it's often more willing than we like to think, kind of assimilating Western characteristics. So going back to so that's sort of a side note. But going back to the case in America, the reason I think why different groups discriminate against others isn't necessarily due to skin color. It's due to the differences, perceived or not, between the various groups. Right? Because why would you discriminate against someone based on their skin color? That's idiotic. Like, it's literally just skin deep. But if, for example,
well, it's idiotic maybe to you and I, but I think it's still cultural in a lot of places. Like you grow up. I mean, I grew up like not having a lot of black people around, but I definitely knew people that were racist, that did not
Oh, no,
like.
I'm not talking about racism. I'm being more specific. I'm saying literally discriminating someone based upon their skin color. I don't necessarily mean discriminating against another race. That's not necessarily the same thing. Because let's imagine, like, let's take Asians, for example. Asians really don't like each other. It's kind of funny. And, like, they're really racist. Like, Westerners think they're racist. They have no thing on Easterners. Easterners are the world champions of racism. They're so racist. And they're not PC at all because they don't have this whole, like, they don't have, like, white people savior complex or, like, white guilt like people do in the West. That's a Western exclusive thing. White people are always trying to, like, help out the downtrodden. It's been like this for hundreds of years. You look at colonial literature, we think of like, oh, colonialism was about domination, which it was, of course, partly, but there was also an attempt to bring up the downtrodden poor savages in the world. So white people have been trying to save the brown people forever, I argue. It's not, it's just a characteristic of Westerners, which Easterners kind of laugh at. They're like, wow, these white people really think they're the hero in the story.
Yeah.
I mean, it just everything is kind of funny. But no, Easterners are way more racist, and they're not PC at all. And so they'll just like go off on like so and so group, and it's. I'm not saying it's good, but it is kind of hilarious as opposed to the West, where you have to try very carefully to choose your words to not have to offend this group or that group, and you're trying. It's like imagine you're trying. There's a bunch of eggs in a room, and you're trying to slowly step to the other side of the room, like crushing in the eggs. And one guy just kicks down the door of a tank and runs over all the eggs to get to the other side. Like, yeah, I made it. I made it to the other side. That's kind of what the East is like in that sense. I think just that juxtaposition is hilarious. Like the Westerners trying so hard to not be offensive. But
I gotta get going, man. We've been chatting for like ever. Like, how long has it been? Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah, it's almost 1:30.
Yeah. It was awesome talking to you. I'm gonna stop this recording.
Sounds good. Yeah.